say a word about the format, and I'll introduce myself, which I know most of you, so it won't be that detailed of an introduction. I'm Kevin Maier, as the slide suggests there. I teach English here at UAS. I'm a relative newcomer to Alaska, and like Robin, I hesitate to claim any sort of expertise on anything Alaskan. So I'm pitching these ideas that they're intentionally provocative, and I trust that many of you here know more about these issues than I do. In fact, I know that many of you do. So I'm hoping to get some feedback on some critiques here of a couple of sacred cows in Alaska, tourism and hatcheries, and to some degree mining as well. So I'll open with about 20 minutes. I have a PowerPoint. I'm not usually in this position of standing behind a podium. I much prefer sitting down in a circle and having conversations. And I'm also quite new to PowerPoint, so please forgive me if my PowerPoint seems juvenile. But after my 20 minutes, my student here, Jess Eller, who knows quite a bit more about Alaska, was born and raised in Homer, and is finishing her degree in English this semester, right? Okay, good. And is writing a thesis about hatcheries. So the title here is mine, and I know, in fact, that Jess and I disagree on some of the kind of ins and outs of hatcheries and of fisheries in Alaska. So my hope is that at the conclusion we can have 10 or 15 minutes remaining for a kind of a conversation. So as I mentioned, I'm a recent transplant to Juneau and not an expert. But when you arrive here, or when you arrive in Southeast Alaska, I should say I came from Oregon and I grew up in Washington State. The two things strike you as really interesting, or one thing in particular, right? If you're here in the summer, or if you're here in May, or if you see it now, right? And that's this sort of culture of mass tourism. They're arriving now, if you haven't noticed, right? The millions of people the million people rather that come here every summer. So this research project is kind of a preliminary effort to answer the question of why do these million people come to Juneau every summer? And a corollary, a second question, that's the first one, and I'm not going to answer it here, but I'm going to try to explore some reasons why that might be. And then the second question of why do nearly 100,000 of these people visit a hatchery? This is brought home to me on a day-to-day basis as I ride the bus or as I drive my car past DIPAC, the Douglas Island Pink and Chum Hatchery, on my way to work from downtown. So these are the two questions. I'm going to try and venture some answers toward them. So the first and most obvious place to look for answers, right, is of course the internet. So I went and Googled this, and one way of figuring out why tourists might be interested in coming to Alaska is to just look at the promotional materials, right? There's no shortage of them online, and the answer to that first question is probably fairly obvious, right? And the theme that comes up again and again as you look at the promotional materials for cruise vacations, which is how the majority of the visitors arrive in Juneau every summer, of course, is that the draw is wilderness, right? So we see here there remain few places on Earth where you can truly breathe, where space is measured not in feet or miles, but in endless horizons. A place where nature is so powerful, so dramatic, a personal encounter can change you forever. This is Alaska, right? We get this hyperbole, this kind of overstated sense of what's here and what the landscape is like, and then it's usually followed with a laundry list of sites that you'll see. So here we have them, classics: White Thunder in Glacier Bay, sunlight at midnight, close-ups of whales, eagles, caribou. The list of animals goes on, and this is from Princess Cruise Lines in 2008. They incidentally changed these things quite frequently. I started looking at this in spring of 2008, and the websites just are refreshed all the time. But here are a couple more, right? This notion that wilderness or unspoiled wilderness is the draw is echoed all over the place. This seems to be what people are coming here for, and we always get these lists. So the answer to the question of why people come here, I think one answer is this idea of wilderness, or the idea of Alaska as this kind of untouched place. But having worked with conservation groups in Oregon and Washington, Trout Unlimited and Oregon Trout in particular, and followed the heated debates over the status of hatcheries in Oregon, where it's not uncommon to see bumper stickers that say, "I catch and release wild steelhead," right? Hatchery fish are now being villainized in Washington and Oregon as a kind of central threat to the stability and the ongoing viability of wild runs. my hunch was, driving past DiePack or riding the bus past DiePack every day, that when you go to DiePack, which 10% of the tourists, roughly 10% of the tourists who come to Juneau do, you're not seeing wilderness, right? You're not seeing wild animals, whales and bears. Instead, you're seeing something else. Because, and I'm coming at this as somewhat of an outsider, but in Washington and Oregon, when you see a hatchery, you're seeing something that's fundamentally artificial, right? The debate there is framed on wild fish, hatchery fish. So my goal is to kind of try and explain what it is that tourists might be seeing. And I think they might be seeing something that tourists have long been coming to Alaska to see. So we know that mass tourism in its current guise with this sort of love boat style cruise boats is a product of the 1980s. But for the last 120, 130 years, people have been coming to Alaska on 20-day, 30-day, 10-day trips, arriving by these big boats. So my goal here is to look at the kind of early history of tourism, in particular the 19th century version of tourism, and try and explain what it is people might be seeing at that hatchery. So we know, right, that tourists have been coming to Alaska since well before the internet, and here's a promotional broadside. Parallels that could read just like any of them on the internet now, but this is from 1891, and it echoes many of those same things, right? We get the matchless grandeur of the trip, the kind of hyperbole, but we also get that laundry list of sights. The visitors tell the same story of midnight sun, the placid waters, of the aurora borealis, of the majestic mountains, inland seas, et cetera, et cetera. The conclusion of this list, though, about halfway down there, it says, of the thundering iceberg plunging into the sea and floating off in its inimitable splendor, of the wealth of fish, timber, and minerals, and of the biggest quartz mill ever constructed. And I want to pause there. The next clause in this, of course, echoes a 19th century sense of race that Robin's presentation kind of hit on, right? And there's much to say and much that has been said on the way that race plays into the desire to see Alaska then and now. But I kind of want to bracket that question and focus instead on this quartz mill, because I think this quartz mill might help us explain what it is that tourists encounter or experience when they go to DiePack. So the quartz mill we're talking about here is, of course, the Treadwell Mill, right? It's constructed in the late 1890s across the channel from downtown Juneau. It's near current day, and then as well near Douglas. And it was, in fact, the original tourist draw for Juneau, right? If you were going to come on the 22-day trip up the Inside Passage, the reason you would come to Juneau would be to see this, right? There it is. So we know, well before the Klondike Gold Rush, John Muir predicted during his famous 1879 canoe trip around Southeast that gold would be found here near Juneau. He was right. 4 years later, San Francisco-based entrepreneurs built the largest gold mine, the largest quartz mine in the world. And this deafening stamp mill that worked around the clock for the better part of 2 decades, crushing hundreds of tons of ore a day and producing thousands of dollars of low-grade gold, was the fundamental draw. This, despite the fact that nearby forests were cut down to build the hydro project to lift the stamp mill's heavy steel plates the way they work. They'd go up very high and then come down crushing on the ore that was extracted from the hills, left the landscape looking fairly desolate, right? And after the stamps had crushed the ore, a chlorination process was used to extract the ore from the remaining product of that mill, and the nearby vegetation was just simply destroyed by a toxic plume of smoke that went up the hillside. So, as one historian described it, Juneau presented a stump-pocked scene of rainy desolation. But this did not seem to faze the nature-loving late 19th century tourists, who nevertheless flocked to visit the massive mining operation just across the Gastineau Channel from Juneau. And what I want to argue that although this might seem contradictory to our 21st century sensibilities, the historian Robert Campbell suggests that tourists were able to reconcile the destruction inherent in the mine with their desire to encounter untouched or unspoiled wilderness under the rubric of the sublime. He calls it, in fact, the industrial sublime, thus the source of my title here, and he suggests that it blended naturally blended nicely with the natural sublime. So this is in his book entitled In Darkest Alaska, Travel and Empire Along the Inside Passage, and he's focusing in particular on this late 19th century moment. And he suggests that this industrial sublime, that is seeing those big stamp mills and being sort of overwhelmed by the sound in the same way you'd be overwhelmed by a natural landscape, worked with contemporary notions of the natural sublime because it seemed to reify or to establish capitalism's naturalness, which was part of the kind of contemporary worldview. So to put it another way, mines were of interest because they represented the human ingenuity necessary to set up an operation whereby wealth effortlessly emerges from the ground. So running 24 hours a day, the perpetual motion machine of the stamp mill operation seemed to harvest money from the earth. And it's a huge hit, right? This is what everybody wants to go and see. You go and you don't get any sense for the actual labor, you just get a sense for this machine making money, right? So tourists were lured with claims of the astounding numbers about the wealth, and the definitive guidebook of the era, Appleton's Guide to Alaska and the Northwest Coast. This was published in 1893. The author, Eliza Skidmore, doesn't seem to miss a beat when she describes an open mine pit aside wildflowers or stamp mills alongside glaciers, because the mines to the 19th century imagination are just another part of nature. It's just part of the same thing. So tourists uniformly registered both awe at the spectacle and a nationalist pride in the sheer amount of rock removed, gold extracted, and wealth produced by the mine. To the 19th century tourist, in other words, Southeast Alaska presented both an awe-inspiring, untouched wilderness and economic potential. And what I want to argue is that it still does, but we're much less comfortable or much less willing to kind of admit that. We don't see, for instance, tourism brochures advertising mines as attractions. In fact, as the mining industry is constantly under siege from environmental groups, almost nobody but miners sees the insides of these mines. It's not something that's out there. Historic mining, on the other hand, remains appealing, right? But only as history. So we see here the Red Dog Saloon. I'm sure many of you have been in here. This is the kind of central attraction. Almost everybody that gets off the boat goes there. But the Red Dog is peddling really a healthy dose of nostalgia rather than a portrait of industrial mining that in fact created the town of Juneau. At this popular tourist destination, we celebrate the prospector, right? Not the engineer or the financier. And likewise, even at tours set up to describe that industrial mine experience, like the contemporary tour of the AJ mine on the Juneau side of the water, they nevertheless conclude with an opportunity to pan for gold. And this is the highlight of the trip, right? I went on this past summer, and you go out there and you walk around and you see these rusting ruins kind of fading back into the wilderness. But the thing that you were most excited about, or that most of the tourists on board were most excited about, was that the conclusion was to be able to go into this little sluice box and to find little flecks of gold in the pan. So even though the actual operation is literally melting back into the landscape, we're here celebrating and championing the individual effort that happened in this, not the big industrial. So both these tours, the Red Dog or the Red Dog Stop on the tourist agenda and the tour of the AJ mine, cater to our sense of mining as a project carried out, usually in a distant past, by intrepid individuals with little large-scale ecological damage. So the point here is that large-scale industrial mines don't sell as part of the packaged tour experience in 2010. What I want to argue, however, is that the mining we do of the ocean remains appealing to the tourist imagination, the contemporary mining of the ocean. So here is, of course, a picture of the Douglas Island Pink and Chum Hatchery. It's on the Egan Drive between here and downtown if you're not from Juneau. And it is, if you look at the tourism statistics, I said 10%, it's the 5th or 6th most popular tour in Juneau. And again, about 9-10% of the people go there. And here I think the Salmon Hatchery is touted in ways that echo how the Alaskan mining industry was hyped to tourists over a century ago, suggesting a possible explanation for my second question of why are all those tour buses parked there, right? What's going on? What's the appeal? So I think that the hatchery presents a modern version of the late 19th century dream of the natural world literally giving up its wealth to crafty humans. So as I noted earlier, 19th century tourists were interested in the Treadwell because it presented a technological illusion whereby the natural world almost magically produces wealth without human labor. And I think hatcheries offer a similar magic. Moreover, both the 19th century mining tour and the contemporary hatchery tour deflect attention from the ecological problems inherent in resource extraction with appeals to civic and economic values. You get these superlative histories of how much money is being created, how many jobs are being created, while simultaneously obscuring the real labor and capital that supports the work. On the Treadwell tour, you don't see the Tlingit and Chinese labor that's going on underground. You just see those massive machines going up and down, and I think a similar thing happens on the hatchery tour. So the primary draw, and to be totally honest here, the primary draw of going to the hatchery tour is to see fish, right? You want to see the wealth of the ocean on display, and the hatchery generally doesn't disappoint, though I would note that people do come and do this tour prior to the arrival of adult fish, and they see different parts of it. But for most of the summer, when the big boats are cruising the inside passage, the wealth of the ocean is there. It's very easy to see, and this is the primary draw. But the tour itself, interestingly, I think, goes to great lengths to amplify this sense of wealth, highlighting the almost unfathomable numbers of fish returning to Alaska waters. And more importantly, embedded in the rhetoric of the tour is a clear argument for the continuation, the necessity even, of the hatchery operation. So the young tour guides, many of whom are my students, incidentally, delight their audience with statistics celebrating Alaskan hatcheries that echo the Treadwell tour numbers. We learn, for example, that the 21 hatcheries in Alaska collect over 1.7 billion salmon eggs, release something like 1.5 billion juvenile fish. Of the roughly 193 million salmon harvested in Alaska each year, more than 30% are of hatchery origin. So without hatcheries, the guide concludes, the natural stocks of salmon would be depleted. In 2007, ocean ranching, as the guide refers to the work of the hatcheries, produced over $64 million worth of salmon, employing hundreds of Alaskans. We learn also that the hatchery salmon egg has a 95% survival rate, while in the wild, only 5% of eggs deposited in stream beds survive to smolt stage. And the tour guides they give this same spiel. I go on this quite frequently. I have a 2-year-old who loves to actually go to the hatchery and see all the fish up close. So I went on it several times during the summer, and you get kind of the canned version. But if you miss the speech, you get it also in signage, right? So, oops, this is the slide I'm looking for. A sign on the edge of the dock entitled "A Salmon's Life Odyssey" establishes that 2,500 eggs in the wild lead to only 2 harvestable adult salmon, while 2,500 eggs in a hatchery lead to 102 adult fish. So, referring to the hatchery as an enhancement of the natural salmon runs, the tour suggests that the hatchery has not only made nature better, but that it performs a necessary service in turning up the hidden treasures of the earth, just as the Treadwell mine turned up the treasures of the earth, right? We're talking, there's a difference here, fish versus gold, but they're quite parallel. And to be sure, on most summer days, tourists in Juneau could probably take a taxi to any nearby stream and see salmon struggling up in the actual gravel, but it wouldn't be as reliable as this, right? The concrete fish ladder produces again and again, and you have that window underneath the water to see them quite close. But the problem with going to the stream is that unlike hatchery runs, natural runs do not come in all at once. We don't have that glass window. And so, to me, the analogy to mining seems pretty clear. That is, you can pan for gold and see a tiny speck here or there, but you need heavy industry to get the real value. Likewise, you might see a pair of salmon or 2 in the stream, but to see the sublime numbers, we need heavy industry. That is, to make any money, we need human ingenuity, and we need it on a large scale. Okay, so I painted the analogy. There are some complications, of course. So unlike the Treadwell mine, the dye-pack facility and most of the hatcheries, I think all the hatcheries in Alaska actually, are nonprofit, serving only to help Alaskan fishermen make a living. So the tour guides remind us that all the proceeds made from harvesting cost recovery salmon go back into the hatchery operation and to support commercial fishing. The signage, again, makes a similar argument, and that's this sign. reminding us that hatcheries were first developed when fishermen realized that the seemingly inexhaustible runs of salmon were in fact exhaustible. So the tour guides also highlight the fact that nothing is wasted in the process of producing salmon for harvest. Edible fish go to homeless shelters and community organizations, while inedible meat from the broodstock goes to crab fishermen. Fish carcasses are made into fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. But despite the cheery environmental message of this tour, made persuasive again by appeals to a rhetoric of both the sublime scale of the project and the kind of economic value here, biologists are telling us that the ecological impact of hatcheries might be akin to the ecological impact of hard rock mines. Again, this is me coming as an outsider. I realize that hatcheries in Alaska are managed differently, and Jess might give us a little bit of that in a second. Yeah?
Could you repeat that, what you just said?
I can, sure. I said, despite the kind of cheery environmental message of the tour, biologists, and I'm referring to here, in particular, to two monographs, Jim Likatowicz's Salmon Without Rivers and Jay Taylor, the historian making salmon, suggest that the ecological impact of hatcheries might be akin to the ecological impact of hard rock mines. This is debatable, right? And I think that in the Alaska context, there are many things that are different about what was going on in Washington and Oregon, which is the context for those two books. But the general argument goes something like this, right? Because hatchery salmon compete with wild fish for habitat, this is where the Alaska situation might be different, right? But also because hatchery salmon change fishing pressure, and because they negatively impact genetic diversity, hatcheries might in fact be a threat to sustaining salmon for future generations. This is the kind of the call of Trout Unlimited and Oregon Trout in Washington. This is this is what everybody's doing there. So this is why when I'm driving by the hatchery, I'm thinking, well, you're not really seeing anything wild there. Why do people want to go to that? And the tour itself also doesn't give us the actual sort of science or the process of making salmon. Instead, we don't see the inner workings of incubators and trays. They're just described briefly and obliquely, but we're told because it's a sterile environment, we can't actually visit the interior of the facility. And the tour works further to defer attention from the laboratory work with some humor, telling us that this is artificial insemination, before directing our attention to the docks, where we might see a more authentic-looking fisherman there spraying down totes or moving things around. So, like the mining tour, that is, the hatchery tour obscures the real labor, drawing attention to the scale of wealth, the machine-like process by which salmon are produced, and the magic of the fact that they return year after year, making salmon the largest agricultural industry in Alaska, as the tour guides conclude. So, by way of conclusion, what I think a potential answer to my second question of why dye pack is explained, at least in part, by the fact that the sublime experience of a visit to a hatchery blends with the natural spectacle of a visit to Alaska even more seamlessly than the Treadwell tour did for 19th century tourists. Tourists see salmon, but they really want to see something more. They're not just there to glimpse that one adult salmon in the screen. So although you may not see the wealth of fish, timber, and minerals listed in the brochures to entice travelers north, that is, since the advent of mass tourism in Alaska, visitors have come to see an unspoiled wilderness of glimmering glaciers, abundant forests, towering mountains, exotic wildlife, as well as economic potential. So although we might find these rhetorics of wilderness and extraction to be at irreconcilable odds, in Alaska it seems they might in fact be mutually supportive ideas. Susan Colleen has persuasively made this case, noting that while it is common to think of Alaska as an example of the last wilderness, it is equally as common to think of the state, as it proclaims on our license plates, right, as the last frontier. And I think several popular tours in Juneau suggest that these two ideas might still go hand in hand, the hatchery tour being one of them. As I hope to have shown here, that is, the competing ideas of wilderness and harvested wilderness have always been part of the way we conceptualize and interact with Alaska as an idea and as a place, creating its unique appeal. So, in other words, the cultural construction of Alaska, popular for tourists today, sells a healthy nostalgia for the pioneering spirit of rugged individuals who came to exploit the land, as well as a desire to see these naturally sublime landscapes fully intact. This paradox, it's worth noting, parallels one at the heart of contemporary questions about the idea or the integrity of the idea of wilderness. So as historians like William Cronin remind us, the idea of wilderness is as much a cultural construction as a natural one. And like management regimes that have become increasingly effective at masking this reality, tours today are much more sophisticated in their veiling of ecological exploitation taking place in these sublime landscapes than they were in the 19th century, when they openly celebrated this type of exploitation. So the industrial sublime survives, that is, but in traces, some of them rusting into the Sitka spruce and Devil's Club, while others are found hidden in the perpetual motion machine of the hatchery's fish ladder. And so I'll turn it over to Jess, who will offer another perspective here.
Good afternoon. I'm Jess Eller, a senior here at UAS, and to graduate, we have to write a thesis, and so I decided to write on salmon hatcheries. I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. Like Kevin said, I was born and raised in Homer, Alaska. It's a fishing town. We're the closest big town and big harbor to Kodiak. My dad and sister both commercially fished. The other thing about Homer is we're the halibut fishing capital of the world. I don't know if you've been there, but go catch a halibut. They're big and good to eat. And I actually worked as a hauling fish for a charter company for several summers. So my family, although we're not primarily involved in fisheries, we definitely dabbled a little bit. After graduating, I went to a couple different schools and decided to take a break from school and found myself living back in my parents' house in my high school bedroom and started looking for jobs. And I actually got into hatchery work because of four keywords. Free, room, and board. The hatcheries, you guys are familiar with DIPAC here in Juneau, but a lot of the hatcheries, most of the hatcheries are actually remote hatcheries. There's only a handful that are actually stationed in town. DIPAC's one of them. There's one in Sitka, Mediviji, one up by Golcana, up in the interior, or up in northern Alaska. But a lot of these hatcheries are remote, and so they give all their employees some kind of housing and some kind of food. So that was why I got involved. Since I got involved with hatcheries, I did 2 9-month contracts in the Prince William Sound, working for the Prince William Sound Aquaculture Corporation. And then I moved out of Alaska for a while and came back each summer to work down here, which is how I ended up in Juneau, but to work for the Northern Southeast Regional Aquaculture Association out of Sitka. Did 2 contracts for them, and then ended up here in Juneau working for DIPAC. So while Kevin was going on his countless tours outside, how many have you gone on, Kevin? Yeah. I was working inside with the salmon. So I guess the question with my thesis that I'm trying to answer is why is DIPAC so popular? You know, for me, it's a completely different experience. So this is my life for several years, and you know, it's different than the people that just go and take the tour. But for me, salmon are inextricably tied to Alaska and who we are as Alaskans. And so that was kind of the bigger question, you know, that I wanted to look at when I was writing my thesis. You know, it's not only is it the salmon, it's also the lifestyle. These hatcheries are remote. We get our groceries by barge or plane twice a month. So you're living with the same people, which is also uniquely Alaskan. There aren't a lot of places left in at least the United States where you can live remote and not only see the 10 people that you see every single day and no one else for the entire summer, or the entire year actually. So those were several questions that I wanted to look at when I was writing this. Salmon hatcheries for me, Kevin has a completely different view on it. Salmon hatcheries for me, it is still wild. This is uniquely Alaskan. These are wild Alaskan salmon. The salmon that we raise there, to go into the process a little bit, the salmon that we have there, they're only with us. We only rear them, give them the fish feed for 3 months at a time. And then they're out in the ocean. Chum are out there 3 to 5 years. Pinks are out there every other year, or they come back every 2 years. So these fish are wild. This is, you know, yes, we are supplementing them, and there have been issues with escapement where the hatchery fish are going into areas where they aren't supposed to be going. So it is a different kind of subset of salmon, but on the other hand, that's something to kind of keep in mind, that these are wild Alaskan salmon. It's what you're buying at Costco. They're not marketed as hatchery wild Alaskan salmon. These are wild Alaskan salmon. So I guess I won't really talk too much about because I'm still working through my thesis, but that is kind of the bigger picture that I'm looking at. But I'll go ahead and read an excerpt from the paper and then open it up for questions, and hopefully we can kind of have a conversation about all of this and talk about whether Kevin and his industrial is correct or me and my wild perspective is more correct. So here's the paper. Esther Hatchery lies on the side of Esther Bay. Oh, sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Esther Hatchery is where I started. It's North America's world's largest hatchery, or North America's largest hatchery, not world, but North America's largest hatchery. And the year that I started working there, we were producing 170 million chum salmon, 90 million pink salmon, and 2 million coho. These numbers are unfathomable. I mean, you can't understand it until you see the bay just flood with salmon. And it's a factory, it really is. We had 20 to 30 seasonal staff there, which myself was one of, come in, and you do the same job, whether it's, depending on the project that we're doing, but for egg take, for example, we were working 10, 12-hour days cutting open fish, making babies, potentially for the next year. So it's a factory, and it was also a really good experience to kind of jump right into because we did everything. The seasonals, they had five fish culturists and manager, assistant manager, but they can't run such a large hatchery. So as a seasonal, we got to do everything. It was a really great experience for me to start out there doing every aspect of salmon culture. So this is a little bit about Esther Hatchery. Esther Hatchery lies on the side of Esther Bay. The hatchery buildings are basic metal buildings slowly rusting into the island, and as is common in most hatchery sites, there is too much equipment for too small a space. This is part of the reason Esther Hatchery is called Esther Trash. It looks like a landfill. Rusted equipment parked haphazardly, buoys and ropes piled to capacity, windows caked with salt. The grass is weed whacked short in the summer if there is time, which most times there isn't. The lagoon lies next to the main building, the largest of the buildings, and around the lagoon the company houses are parked. One dirt road runs from the barge landing, where the groceries and mail are delivered once a month, around the houses and up the hill, ending abruptly as if someone had simply picked the pencil off the paper too soon. The road hasn't been graded since they installed it 20 years ago, and Rodrigo has broken his ankle twice on his walk to work slipping in a pothole. But despite Esther's disheveled aesthetic, she retains something of a used beauty. The birds perch atop the resting equipment, watching rubber-clad workers sling fish, recalling to mind Alaska days past. The bugs are thick in the summer, the snow is thick in the winter. No matter the season, the obstacles of Alaskan outdoors are always afoot. Inside the hatchery, the rooms are warehouse-like, with the exception of the workers' sleeping quarters. Those are small and furnished with used prison furniture. The company got a good deal during a sale. But outside, under the metallic surface of Esther Bay, the salmon come back. The salmon reared at the hatchery return to it in a roundabout way. They enter Esther Bay across from the hatchery, swim along the shore to the head of the bay, pausing briefly at the small stream there, before the stronger lake-fed stream next to the hatchery pulls them away. They end either on the outside of the barrier seine, where they circle uneasily until death, or, for a fortunate few, their lives end in the hatchery, becoming next year's broodstock. The workers' lives revolve around the fish. Their job requires that the fish come back, which is their job, to make fish. Esther Island is not a welcoming environment for anyone but the fish, but the workers make do, settling into the rusty buildings, motoring the broke-down boats along her shores, and making a life where 40 years ago there was none. Despite the difficulties, the workers and fish return, and life at the hatchery becomes routine. In the wild, salmon are birthed in streams. The orange roe are buried beneath gravel and snow, incubating the entire winter. The eggs become alvin, eventually becoming fry. The fry, depending on the species, then make their way down the streams and rivers into the ocean, or up into a freshwater lake, and eventually to the ocean, where they migrate out into the great blue. Years later, for pinks 2 years, for chums 3 to 5, they return to the exact spot where their lives began and begin the cycle anew. They spawn, propagating life in future runs. Their decomposing bodies float downstream and onto the banks, fertilizing the soil, feeding predators, and providing nutrients to their hundreds of future children. This primal process has conditioned these fish, who have danced this journey for time immemorial. Now we do this for them. In the 1970s, the salmon hatchery, which had been utilized in other countries for hundreds of years, was brought to Alaska to compensate for the depletion of wild salmon stocks. Individual corporations, most of them nonprofits, were created, managers and employees hired, and salmon production began. Salmon creation, a process regarded as spiritual by indigenous Alaskans, became an industry. The first hatcheries produced 30 million salmon annually. Those numbers are now in the billions, with hatcheries throughout Alaska. So that's kind of the introduction to my thesis. I guess one thing that I kind of want to point out too, in contrast to Kevin's take on everything, is the hatcheries, the fishermen come back. This is authentic Alaska. We work directly with the fishermen. We work directly. They fund these corporations. They have to pay a tax, so they fund the corporations. DiePack is an interesting example because it doesn't really have the same aspect that a lot of these hatcheries have. It's clean, for one. It's very clean. They have to keep it clean. They must cooperate with the city. They have to let so many fish up a stream for the tourist sites, and then when the fish die, they have to go back through and pick the dead fish off the beach. It's a very kind of organized process. When you're remote, you're remote. If stuff breaks, you can't get it. Everything's fixed with duct tape or welding sometimes if we have the right equipment. And everything's messy. It's dirty, it's messy, it's broke down. So yes, although, you know, DiePack is a hatchery, it's a different kind of hatchery. And I think the tourists are, I mean, I know they're going because it's easy to get to. And the other hatcheries maybe don't want so many tourists around too, so. Rudy.
Do you think that the process of hatching?
Oh, you need a microphone. You gotta ask a question.
Okay.
But I can give you one.
You guys can ask questions for Kevin too.
Do you think that the process of hatching fish or salmon in a hatchery could biologically put strain on the groups of fish and perhaps even hinder them for future generations?
The way that the hatcheries are organized is are located is they originally set them up in areas where they weren't competing with a natural run, and so this is kind of a different strain of fish. One of the problems, actually, after I left the Sound, my boyfriend and I, he worked at the hatchery too, we left Prince William Sound Aquaculture Corporation, who, although it's a great company to work for in a lot of aspects, has a lot of kind of internal conflict as well. The year after we left, there was a huge article in the Anchorage Daily News about escapement, where the hatchery fish were ending up in places where they shouldn't have been. Pinks have a tendency to kind of wander, and that was a big deal because of that. What you're asking about is that it's a different strain, it's a different genetic kind of code that this hatchery fish have, and so that is a concern. But the way that they've kind of nip that in the bud is that they have set these hatcheries up in locations where this shouldn't happen. So, and in the Sound, although it is a concern, I think it's something like 70% of the fish caught there are hatchery fish. So
you don't think that the forcing the fish to reproduce on an artificial level could actually hinder them for future generations?
Potentially. I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly. You know, they do change up runs, things like that. But as far as what we're doing, it's not completely artificial. It's how to spawn a salmon. If you guys want to how to spawn a salmon lesson is with the hens, they come down, you sort them out, and then the hens you pick up by the back of the head. We have this thing called Zac knives that come off the back of your hand like this. You slit them open, the eggs spill out, and if they're good, they're pink and beautiful, and if they're bad, they usually have kind of a dot inside them, or they're a different color. And then you send them down a chute or a slide, and then there's someone there with the male essentially just squeezing the milk out of them onto the eggs. And so it's not like we're forcing them to do something that they're not. These fish are ready to spawn. They would be spawning in the streams if we weren't cutting the eggs out of them. Because when they're not ready, the eggs hang up inside in those sacs. So it's not like we're really changing the timing or, you know, things like that. We're just kind of doing it in an area where we can control. So.
Just quickly, Greg, I'll just make a comment about that. I mean, there's been a lot written about this. Those two books that I mentioned offer the kind of the critique of hatchery positions. But Bill Smoker, I think, in the School of Fisheries, has written extensively about this. And there's a sense that in Alaska, the way the management regimes are different. What I find very interesting, and I'm certainly not a scientist and I won't pretend to comment with any authority on the science of this, what I find very interesting is that this question of hatcheries that is so much a part of the debate in Washington and Oregon isn't even really on the radar here, right? I mean, the issue is always deferred or sort of pushed aside by the claim that, oh, it's just managed better here. And I know the scientists are writing about it and that it's there, but I'd encourage you to go and read it. It's a lot of it's very accessible and interesting. So,
Just a comment, since we're having a discussion here.
yeah.
I think people have been coming to Alaska for centuries basically to find adventure. And back 100 years ago, they'd come to see the mines, to see these tough gold miners and this adventurous spirit. Today they come because when they see a salmon, it's in a store, Safeway store somewhere in St. Louis, and this is their adventure. And I have this, am I turned on here? No, sorry. I have this small business here, and my business model is to sell the illusion of adventure. And it's true.
Yeah.
And what we do is we look at the people coming in and we figure out what kind of thing what makes an adventure for them. And it could be a kayaking trip, it could be a hiking trip, it could be whale watching, something simple as that. And we've even gone so far, when one corporate group came up 2 years ago, they insisted that we'd need guns to protect them from bears. So we accommodated them. We got guns. We took out the firing pins so they wouldn't work. But we stood there and let them take pictures with us holding guns. But I think the illusion of adventure is a lot of why people go to DIPEC. That's their adventure, seeing that and seeing bears and other things. That's just a comment.
Well, and the hatchery doesn't disappoint. Like Kevin was saying, you know, we all wear the Grundens and the extra tufts, and you know, for the most part, especially when we are working with the fish, you're slimy and gross, and so we fit that, you know, Alaskan fisherman look. Even though I've never commercially fished, but I can look like one for part of the year. So,
Kevin, this is more for you, but maybe Jess wants to comment too. You know, in my view, Western culture has had basically since industrial age a worship of technological advances, and of course an awful lot of our tourism, you think of, if you down south, the dams that we created in the last, you know, century are just incredible tourist attractions because of their technological, you know, of essentially, you know, here we are, if you want to, controlling the environment and so on. Of course, we've learned a lot about how, you know, Mother Nature doesn't get control. Like the whole control of the Mississippi has been a disaster, you know, by the Corps of Engineers, because they thought they could control the Mississippi, but you can't, and it's overrun, and you know, most of their engineering has been a disaster, and of course we know what the Delta's like. So, but I think that the industrial sublime, I guess that's kind of what you're saying in a different way. But I think we look at it now, it's the same kind of thing. I look at the Obama administration and the whole thing about energy right now. We're doing the same thing. We're worshiping the technology, whether it's wind energy or others, all these different ways. I mean, we can say that it's going to get us out of the carbon, but the truth is it's one more step of just doing looking at the best technological advances.
Right.
So anyway, I just thought that it seems to me that part of why you get that is, at least in Western tourists, including myself, is you always want to go and look at this incredible technological advance, as well as you might want to go and visit the natural parts of wherever you are, and whether it's this country or any other country that you're visiting.
Yeah, it seems to me that that sense of, I mean, when I was a kid, my grandparents took me to see Grand Coulee, right? And you heard Woody Guthrie singing "Roll On, Columbia, Roll On." Now it seems like you wouldn't go and have that kind of experience at the Columbia Dam. You go there and you'd think, oh, they buried Celilo Falls. Oh, there are no more fish. Or oh, they have to barge the fish around the dams. And there's this kind of nostalgia for a bygone era. But it's true. I think it's really interesting. So I guess we're out of time, but thanks. I'm around, and I'd love to talk about this more. I have an office here on campus, and I teach classes about these issues. So if you do have questions, I'm working on this paper, and it's really in its preliminary stages. And Jess also is around, at least for another couple of months. So do come and grab us. Jess works in the Learning Center. It's easy to find her there. So I'd love to keep this conversation going. So thanks.